Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome to all of you. I'm delighted to open the third session of our WHO MRO webinar series on institutionalization of evidence-informed policymaking for delivery for impact. I'm Mehnaz Khairandish, Regional Advisor for Evidence and Data to Policy at the WHO Regional Office for Eastern Mediterranean, and will moderate this session with my colleague, Ms. Malika Tamim, who is our technical officer. We are truly pleased to see such a strong and continued engagement from the countries across the region and beyond. And as you may recall, the series was launched to support countries in strengthening systems for evidence-informed policymaking and to spotlight global and regional experiences, tools, and innovations that can guide our work. Our first session focused on innovations in evidence synthesis and was led by our colleagues from Cochrane, where we explored how systematic and living evidence synthesis methods can help respond to urgent and evolving policy needs. The second session, delivered by colleagues at the King Saud University, centered on quality assessment in guideline development, and that session highlighted the importance of robust methodologies and quality tools to ensure the evidence-based recommendations. Today, we are pleased to host the third session, which will focus on adapting clinical practice and public health guidelines with MAGIC Evidence Ecosystem Foundation. Adaptation is a critical step in ensuring that global guidelines are tailored to national and local contexts, reflecting the realities and priorities of each country. MAGICapp is a digital platform that enables the creation, adaptation, and sharing of evidence-based guidelines in a transparent and dynamic manner. It supports the development of living guidelines and a structured approach to adaptation and contextualization. We are very fortunate to be joined today by two colleagues from the MAGIC Evidence Ecosystem Foundation, who will guide us through how the platform works and how it can be used in adaptation process to support better health policy and practice. I would kindly ask you, all participants, to remain muted during the presentations, and we encourage you to use the chat box or question and answer box for questions, comments, and suggestions. We will conclude today's session with closing remarks by Dr. Arash Rashidian, who is the Director of the Science Information and Dissemination at the WHO Regional Office for Eastern Mediterranean, and who is leading the whole agenda for evidence-informed policymaking in the region. Let me now take a moment to introduce our speakers for today's session. Our first speaker is Dr. Per Olav Vandik, who is the founder and currently chief scientist at the MAGIC Evidence Ecosystem Foundation. MAGIC is a non-profit organization committed to enhance the evidence ecosystem through global and kind collaboration. A core mission is to support development and dissemination of digitally structured guidelines, evidence summaries, and decision aids to clinicians and patients through the MAGIC online authoring and publication platform. On behalf of MAGIC, Dr. Vandik, he also co-steers the BMJ Rapid Recommendations and international collaboration with the BMJ to accelerate evidence into practice through trustworthy recommendations. Within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and infodemic, Dr. Vandik and MAGIC demonstrated the success by providing new solutions to critical challenges with clinical practice guidelines through trustworthy and living evidence and guidance, as exemplified through the WHO Living Guideline on COVID-19 drugs. Dr. Vandik is also a hospital-based internist and professor of medicine at the University of Oslo, Norway. Our second presenter will be Dr. Nicholas Delvaux, who is a part-time general practitioner and an associate professor at KU Leuven, Department of Public Health and Primary Care. His research is focused on dissemination and adaptation strategies of clinical practice guidelines and educational strategies for healthcare communication and shared decision-making. He leads research on dissemination and adaptation at the MAGIC Evidence Ecosystem Foundation. Recent projects have included research on the development of infographics as dissemination formats for guidelines on postnatal and infant health for the Global Evidence Local Adaptation Project in 3 African countries. In Belgium, he is involved in guideline methodology and development and has co-authored numerous national and international clinical practice guidelines. Thank you to both of you that accepted our invitation to attend and to join us for this session, Dr. Van Wyk and Dr. Nicholas. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to a rich and engaging discussion. And Dr. Van Wyk, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mernaz. And there, everyone. I understood from Arash that we're competing with the DG of WHO right now in a probably more interesting meeting. So thanks for those of you that showed up to this one. And thanks for those kind introductory words. So we will just get started and go through more or less what Mernaz explained in terms of what we do in MAGIC. So I took the liberty to rephrase the title of this presentation a little bit. We will focus on adaptation of guidelines heavily, and Nicholas will go deeply into that. But I would like to frame our presentation within the wider evidence ecosystem and how that could support also EMRO and the countries you work with. And I want to jump straight to the point of care, because that's actually where MAGIC has its key focus. I know that you are very much focused on evidence-informed policymaking, but I also realize you have a key interest in guidelines. And this presentation will be about guidelines for clinical practice and public health. So this is a patient I called John. He was hospitalized in my hospital, suffering a new stroke. He was ready to be discharged with a couple of new drugs. He's 65 years old. He's got diabetes mellitus type 2. He also had a myocardial infarction some 10 years ago. So he has cardiovascular disease. He's on a number of drugs and he's overweight. He's got a BMI of 33. The question that came up in this consultation was actually from the patient himself. What about getting this drug called Ozempic? All my buddies get this drug. And I wonder if it's something for me. That is a new drug. It's a GLP-1 receptor agonist that does have a key role in diabetes type 2 and also in reducing cardiovascular and kidney outcomes. Another drug that he wondered about is called SGLT2 inhibitors. And those drugs are now quite relevant, I think, also for your countries. So I'll use this as a case throughout my presentation to talk about what we try to support countries with through MAGIC. Of course, the question is in these situations, how could this doctor make sure John gets the right drug treatment in this case at the right time? This means we have to think about the whole evidence ecosystem. And if we want to have an impact on policy and practice, of course, development of guidelines, publication of guidelines, adaptation of guidelines, implementation of guidelines is key, but it needs to belong into this wider picture. I'm going to show you how we work to develop new tools for decision support in MAGIC. And in this case, you could imagine that the doctor and John would access this tool, and it's called Match It. And it looks like this. In the starting point, first page here, you would have to identify your patient based on the risk of cardiovascular or kidney disease. So in this case, there are 3 risk groups, and John is definitely in the higher risk group. If you click on the link here, you'll see the benefits and harms of these drugs compared to standard care, SGLT2 inhibitors, GLP-1 receptor agonists, and a couple of new drugs in the class of alternatives. I'm showing this because presenting evidence and making it understandable and accessible to clinicians and their patients is really at the core of everything we do in MAGIC. And in this case, the data is based on a large systematic review and network meta-analysis of more than 10,000 estimates of effect now. So it's enormously complex evidence. And how could we let clinicians and patients make well-informed decisions based on best current evidence in this case? You could see here on all the patient-important outcomes on the left column here, you have some green colors showing that definitely these two drugs are effective, actually quite amazingly effective in these patients in reducing death, strokes, myocardial infarctions, heart failure, kidney failure, body weight, in particular for GLP-1 receptor agonists. And there's some differential effects here for those outcomes. And there are also harms. You have to think about some key harms in this case. Now, if you want to know more about the benefits, you can click and see that this comes from a relative effect here. In this case, odds ratio 0.88. These are the absolute effects, and you could visualize the benefits in a way that actually supports shared decision making. So this is just a glimpse of some tools we develop in MAGIC, trying to make it easier to make those decisions at the point of care. This is also supported by our research. So we do research on how formats, how guidelines, how evidence profiles work for end users. And in this case, we tested those quite complex tools as match it with medical students. And it did show that even medical students could understand and make use of that evidence, being quite naive to both evidence-based medicine and clinical practice. So it reflects a shift also in evidence-based medicine to focus on these tools and how clinicians and patients could make well use of them. So this means I will talk about now, as was mentioned in the introduction, I'll talk about MAGICapp and how it allows hopefully more efficient authoring, dissemination, and updating of guidelines within an enhanced evidence ecosystem. I'll talk about living evidence and guidance and ongoing initiatives there. And we'll have time for questions and answers from the MRO perspective before Nicolas will talk much more in detail about dissemination, adaptation, and translation of guidelines, again with time for questions and answers in the end. And I think the reason we're invited here today to talk about guidelines is that they are critical tools for healthcare professionals. And they have to be trustworthy, and they have to be timely, up-to-date, and accessible at the point of care. Now, this sets the bar quite high for professional societies and countries, ministers of health who are responsible for creating those guidelines, because they have to apply advanced standards, and you probably know about the Institute of Medicine standards, the Guideline International Network standards for trustworthy guidelines, the grade methods, and MAGIC is focusing then on tools, technology, digital data, and processes. And the BMJ Rapid Recommendations exemplifies how we work on processes. So I'll give you examples of these advances. I would say great advances in standards, methods, processes, and tools, all needed to make this evidence ecosystem more efficient. And that's, as was said in the introduction, that is what we do in MAGIC. We try to add technology and processes to enhance guidelines in the evidence ecosystem. I just also want to say a few words about culture. I think culture is absolutely critical. It's the reason why evidence-based medicine has been so successful. And this picture shows Gordon Guyatt, who's also one of the founders of MAGIC, in addition to EBM and GRADE. And on the right side, Victor Montori. Victor is a great colleague at the Mayo Clinic in the US, responsible for their work in shared decision-making. More recently, he's championing a patient revolution for kind and careful care. And I think it serves as an important reminder that the goal is not guidelines or EBM, it's how we care for our patients with evidence. That's also to be kept in mind in everything I say. Now, talking about standards and methods, we, of course, in MAGIC use GRADE. It actually was an acronym to start with to express making GRADE the irresistible choice. So we start out by formulating clear questions. We go out and find systematic reviews that are relevant or have to do them ourselves. Then we make our grades and refine tables, and we move from evidence to recommendations using the evidence to decision framework. And we make recommendations for or against, strong or weak, and we publish the recommendations through MAGICapp. And so everything we do is based on these standards for trustworthy guidelines and grade methods. Moving to MAGICapp, we launched this platform in 2013. It's an authoring and publication platform. It's a web-based application, so software as a service, as it's called. And the point is that guideline panels, such as WHO, an increasing number of departments at WHO now use this platform, and they create the guideline from scratch in a digitally structured format, from the PICO questions to the grades and refine tables, to all the text in the guideline. It's in a database in the cloud, and it's structured and tagged content. And when you produce or author the guideline in this format, it's much easier to disseminate and publish in new formats. So the principle is that we publish the recommendations coming first, and then you click and you find more multi-layered formats on all devices. It then will be easier to integrate in the electronic health record, linked to patient data, what we call computerized decision support systems. And a very important principle is that now the recommendations are the entities, not the full guideline in a PDF format, for example. So that means you could plug the recommendations or the evidence summaries or decision aids as we have them into any information resource. And I'll show you how portals, websites, and other information channels will be critical to fully make use of such a way to create guidelines. And Nicholas will talk more about that, as well as adaptation. So how could you more easily adapt, more efficiently adapt and translate, say, a WHO guideline or an EMRO guideline into the local or national use in your region? So adaptation, translation, again, Nicholas will cover today. We will automatically produce decision aids for shared decision-making, and up to the far left, you have the arrow saying dynamic updating. And this is the concept behind living evidence, living guidelines. At the bottom, you could see one of the guideline recommendations for COVID-19 therapeutics by WHO, remdesivir. In this case, this is the recommendation saying we suggest treatment with this for remdesivir. Now, this recommendation actually changed throughout the pandemic, and you could see to the right, we say updated evidence, no change in recommendation. This is an example where we built more functionality to communicate living guidelines and what's new, even at the recommendation level. And another feature that we developed to accommodate for living guidelines fully is a version control. So you could click and you could easily find the previous versions in this time machine approach we have here. So this is MAGICapp, and I'm happy to take more questions, but I will give you an example how it looks like for end users. What do we mean by evidence ecosystems? This figure shows how we felt there was a true need to move beyond the silos we typically work in and let data flow from its production through trials and other studies to the left here into even living evidence syntheses or living systematic reviews and health technology assessments and living guidelines and decision aids produced and disseminated, open access, user-friendly formats to the point of care at much higher speed than before. And then it needs to be followed by efficient implementation and evaluation of impact on policy or practice. And this is also called a learning health system at the bottom, and you'll get the slides. There's a link there's a reference to a paper we wrote in Journal of Clinical Epidemiology 2020 about these different models for evidence ecosystems and learning health systems. So the point is, this loop needs to go round and around, and it drives everything we do in MAGIC. And at the end, I hope we can discuss how this loop could be enhanced also for the countries you work with. In 2016, we were pretty frustrated by the fact that now we had the guideline authoring and publication platform, MAGICapp. We had this framework for the evidence ecosystem, but organizations struggled to change the way they work. And among the many barriers were how can people globally collaborate on evidence and guidelines? And this is the reason why we created what is called the BMJ Rapid Recommendations. So this is a project that MAGIC owns, and we have the journal BMJ as a partner, and so far we published 25 guidelines. And what we wanted to show in 2016, and then we continue our working on, is how we enhance the evidence ecosystem. So the goal about 10 years ago was to show we could do this in 3 months from a new trial that could change practice to published global, trustworthy, accessible guidelines through MAGICapp and BMJ. And now we're working on additional challenges such as adaptation, translation, and implementation of guidelines. And I'll give you examples of this. This is our lab to continuously innovate the evidence ecosystem. Another point is that we also have to establish partnerships. So we have several partnerships, and we've had so for many years, to see how we could work together, one being with Cochrane and another one being with Australia. And they are really the pioneers of living evidence. And some of the examples I will give comes from our collaboration with the Australian Living Evidence Consortium. Now, coming back to this patient, John, and where could the doctor go to find an answer? Well, you've seen the best current evidence through the MAGIC tool, but I'll show you how guidelines look like in the BMJ Rapid Recommendations to give you a few principles about dissemination of guidelines to the point of care. And just a few screenshots here to say that we use infographics, and Nicholas will talk more about infographics, but this is made by the designer in BMJ, and it shows how on the first page of the journal publication, you'll find a visual representation of who the patients are, what the interventions are, and then also the recommendations. And these are very popular among healthcare professionals and even patients, as our research has demonstrated. Now you can click then and go from the journal publication into the guidelines hosted in the MAGICapp in this case. So you click and you find the recommendation. And this is what every recommendation looks like in MAGICapp in principle. So you have a short actionable recommendation text. In this case, we suggest starting an SGLT2 inhibitor, oral GLP receptor agonist. So both drugs are okay. It means you should engage with your patient. There's a link to the MAGIC tool, and then you could start discussing with your patient. But there's also a link to the grades and refine tables through these tabs, to the evidence to decision factors, the rationale for the recommendation, practical information about how to take the drug, dosages, etc., shared decision-making tools, etc. So for each recommendation, you can click and find more. In this case, we have this tool to present the evidence. And in this situation, John chose to use an Ozempic drug. Now, this guideline, of course, is out of date. So it's 4 years old. This is an area where there's a lot of new studies and new drugs. So I'll come back to how this has to fit with living evidence. And indeed, this breakthrough we experienced through COVID-19 now warrants other examples of how we could succeed with global collaboration on dynamic updating of guidelines. This is a cartoon from Nature. It shows how this big friendly giant brought the studies or the papers from the researchers into the hands of policymakers and clinicians at record speed. And we worked with many organizations, and this just shows how the evidence ecosystem framework can look like within the context of living evidence. So lots of new studies here at 9 o'clock, all the time new studies on drugs. There were 2 teams in the world doing living network meta-analyses. The French Cochrane team, we worked with McMaster University, about 50 people, dynamically updating every week a living systematic review and network meta-analyses, which then informed both the World Health Organization, NICE in the UK, Australia, Germany, and others, in this case using MAGICapp, to produce living guidelines that we also published in the BMJ as rapid recommendations. Then we would disseminate, and we did disseminate guidelines, and the Australians had the world record in 2 weeks from a trigger trial to publication of guidelines. Now, this means we still have to complete the final steps. And that is where I think we did not succeed in COVID-19 to show that the WHO guidelines, for example, were truly found and made use of by member states. I think we can come back to how critical that is when Nicholas talks about adaptation, translation, and local use of guidelines. This shows how the guidelines look like on their portal. So when you publish living guidelines, you need to make sure that the entry point, in this case, the WHO landing page, works well. And then you could click and you go from the guideline into, or you go into the full guideline and find all the content. So you click and you find the recommendations. And you could imagine you're a country and you want to adapt one of these, and Nicholas will show you how we're developing new tools to do this more efficiently. Again, you can click and find these new formats for how to support shared decision-making, for example. I would just want to say that, and this is maybe a bit specific to those of us publishing guidelines in journals, when you want to publish living evidence, it's a big challenge. Now, we publish our living guidelines in BMJ, looking like this with infographics and links out to MAGICapp, but it's really tricky to publish guidelines in journals in a living format. Also want to say that if you want to move to living evidence, the living evidence synthesis is critical. So in this case, these large systematic review teams were absolutely the engine behind the living guidelines. Finally, I want to show you an example of how portals could be designed for guidelines overall to better succeed with dissemination. This is the Australian COVID-19 guideline landing page. They published their living guideline June 2020 with a beautiful setup here where you could see what's new. So suddenly it becomes more important that people know where to go to find what's new in what is a living, dynamically updated guideline. And you could then click and you find flow charts and all sorts of dissemination tools. Again, Nicholas will talk more about this. So what have we learned so far through all our experiences in MAGIC? I think in general, we have found some progress. We can succeed with more efficient authoring and publication and dynamic updating of guidelines. We work in some large international projects, one called GELA, which is on neonatal and maternal health in 3 African countries. Another one is MARC-SC Africa and malaria resistance in Africa. And we work in a project called OPERA, focusing on the use of AI in clinical practice, and other EU Horizon projects we're involved in. Living evidence should help, but absolutely what is critical now is to focus on the last step, and that's where Nicholas will take over to talk about dissemination, adaptation, translation, and then implementation. I want to show you some hope. One example, recent example, how we try to address this in MAGIC, and then we have time for questions. So this is an example of a new way to treat patients with rheumatoid arthritis and inflammatory bowel disease and psoriasis. It's called therapeutic drug monitoring. And there was a trial showing that if you measure the blood levels of a particular drug called infliximab in patients with these conditions, and you adjust the dosing, regardless of their symptoms, they would fare better. 18% absolute difference in people not getting a flare of their chronic disease condition. Last November, we published a guideline, a BMJ rapid recommendation, suggesting to use therapeutic drug monitoring. This is really precision medicine, so it works. Now, what we also did was to work with the Norwegian Professional Society of Rheumatologists, so they could adapt and translate that international guideline into a national guideline in Norway. And actually, they published their national guideline before we published the BMJ rapid recommendation because of peer review delays. So they published here at the bottom in Norwegian their national guideline with a guideline recommendation in MAGICapp, adopted, translated, and I'll show you how that happened. But we also are able to monitor impact on care through using the registry of data of people treated with this drug. So it actually is an example of how we close the loop, and we will update the evidence and recommendations because now there's a large ongoing trial at the EU level that will be much better powered to give definite answers. And it shows how the loop could go around and around. And this is really where we want to focus our attention and our efforts in MAGIC moving forward. So in this case, you see on the left, the guideline recommendation in MAGICapp from the BMJ rapid recommendations. To the right, it's translated using AI into Norwegian. And in this case, the Norwegian panel elected to adopt the recommendation, and they could plug it into their Norwegian guideline in Norwegian here. Not easy to understand for you guys, but it shows at the bottom the content in MAGICapp. And this is what we call widgets. So you could plug recommendations into any information resource. So this is the approach we take for adaptation translation. Few words on living evidence in the end, before we take some questions. There is now opportunities to get funding for living evidence, and this needs to go through global collaboration on dynamic updating of trustworthy evidence and guidance. On the left, there's an initiative called Alive. On the right, there is a launch of funding from Wellcome Trust, Evidence Synthesis Infrastructure Collaborative, and I encourage all of you to engage in that group because it really would allow us to fund global efforts to collaborate on evidence. And to just show you how this could look, if we could dream a little bit, for diabetes, obesity, and living evidence, I went to Colombia last fall. This picture shows some sculptures from the famous artist Botero, a bit obese here in Bogota, these sculptures. And it shows how Latin America is one continent where there's a huge need to provide trustworthy guidelines for these diabetes type 2 drugs. So ideally, we will now be able to share what we'll publish a few weeks from now, living guidelines, an update of what you've seen before in this presentation, living guideline, and systematic view, and that we hope could be shared. So ideally, it could work like this. In this evidence ecosystem, regardless of topic, we would have new drugs and you'd have new trials or other information that's coming out. We could do updates of living systematic reviews. In this case, we are publishing such one in a few weeks from now, even living reviews on prognosis, bias and preferences. We publish living guidelines. We are working with the essential medicines list at WHO. Could make use of the same evidence. We hope WHO and PAHO could make use of this evidence for their guidelines to come. And we want to support countries with living cost effectiveness analyses and living reviews of quality improvement strategies. Now, this kind of work can be done if we collaborate globally. And the question is, how could you hook up? We also need to demonstrate impact in countries, and that is what is so important now also for WHO to show the value of their guidelines. So in conclusion, I think we're looking at an enhanced evidence ecosystem. We're only halfway there, and Nicholas will talk more about the final steps, but we have at least a few minutes for questions and answers at this stage. And then in the end, I guess, Arash, you could also summarize. I'll stop sharing and see if there's any questions by now before we hand it over to Niklas.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Wendy, for the great presentation. It was very nice to hear about, the feature of this magic, tools and platform, and also hear about your projects and how you use these tools to keep all these recommendations, up to date and kind of living recommendations. So let's see if there is any comments from participants. Please just if you have any, just unmute yourself and ask your question, please. Or I cannot see, Malika, there's any comments on the chat box or question and answer box?
Yes, we have two questions from the Q&A box. So the first one is Khada Abu Murad. She is asking, hello, is this evidence-based medicine for best medication choice? What about evidence-based medicine for lifestyle and diet changes? The second question is from Professor Zakaria Belhiti from Morocco, Muhammad VI University. He's asking, to what extent does the MAGICapp collaboration use AI in bracket machine learning in fostering the quality and timeliness of evidence synthesis? Two, so he has another question. I noticed R as a software was used. What are the benefits of using R instead of other software for the grading of recommendations?
Okay, thank you. So the first question was on diabetes, more specifically, and I maybe should have been more clear to say this is just one example of a topic we work with. Of course, for diabetes, trustworthy guideline recommendations for lifestyle interventions are critical. They should come before drugs. The BMJ rapid recommendations are focused, so we provide recommendations for specific topics that hopefully people could adapt into their guidelines. So if you have a national guideline in one of the countries in your region, you could plug recommendations for the drugs into your national guideline. So what I've shown here works across all sorts of topics in clinical medicine. I didn't give examples of public health, but of course, through WHO guidelines, you could look at different system level interventions and public health interventions as well for newborn health or malaria or other topics. So I just used this as an example. The second question was, Mernaz, could you remind me? Or Malika, thanks.
Yeah, I'll read it again. The second question, it has two parts. The first part is, to what extent does the MAGICapp collaboration use AI or machine learning in fostering the quality and timeliness of evidence synthesis? And the second part is, I noticed R as the software was used. What are the benefits for using R instead of other software?
Thank you. Yes, sir. Super. So MAGIC does not want to do evidence synthesis. We work with Cochrane and others, and what we can allow is that data from evidence synthesis, for example, in RevMan, flows straight into MAGICapp summary find tables. Just as Grade Pro GGT has that function, you could take the data straight into MAGIC from an evidence synthesis platform, such as RevMan. We use R to create the data for the MatchIt tool, and the grading of recommendations is something we all struggle with for network meta-analysis, but for standard system I use, it happens in MAGICapp. So R is just an example how we use another software for network meta-analysis. Thanks for those great questions.
Any other question, Malika?
No, that's all.
So, Dr. Wendy, let me ask one question myself. So, you know that in our region, we have countries with different level of capacities in terms of technical capacity and other types of resources. So, my question is, how do you think the countries in our region, they can benefit from MAGIC tools and platform to adapt global guidelines to their own context? Thank you.
Yeah, so that is a great question. And the case is that we're a nonprofit. We would like to offer use of MAGICapp for free to countries, say in LMIC settings. But but you need to have a license to use MAGIC to publish guidelines as an organization. We have about 40,000 individual authors and users. They could use it for teaching and creating recommendations and grades and refine tables. But if you want to publish guidelines, you need a license. WHO has an organization-wide license. If countries want to use MAGIC, they need to reach out to us, and we'll see how we could support them by having access to the platform. But I think that is a relevant question for sure.
Thank you so much. So if there is no further question, so we can go to, with thanks to you, Dr. Van Dijk, we can go to the next presenter, Dr. Delbo, for your presentation. Thank you. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. See if I can share my screen. Yes, should be working. Okay. So as mentioned, I will be diving deeper into the elements of, let's see, it switched around. Let's see if I can move that around. Working with two screens here. 1 minute, I'll just drop one of the screens. Yeah, that'll be better. So I'll be diving into things on adaptation and implementation, dissemination more specifically, and translation. This is the beautiful picture we already were introduced to with the giant. We're talking about all the published studies that in this case was on COVID-19 that were overwhelming us as guideline developers and scientists, and trying to make way out of this this overload of information. And I think adaptation is one of those things that is one of the possible solutions for countries, specifically countries that may be struggling with resources, to be able to do trustworthy guideline development as well, despite maybe not having the resources to manage this giant of publications and trying to get sense out of that. So I think adaptation is definitely something which is very important for a lot of countries, and I think the focus for low and middle income countries is maybe a little bit wrong in this case, because I'm from Belgium. We're definitely not a low resource country, but a lot of the guideline development we do also works with adaptation principles. So it's definitely something which across the board can be very interesting for countries to be able to make good quality guidelines. So let's dive a little bit into, and this is what we'll be talking about today. I'll be giving a small background on what is adaptation, what do we understand of adaptation, and what are some challenges, what are some solutions, including the difficulties with adapting living evidence. And then I'll be diving into some of the possible solutions that we've worked with within the Magic Evidence Ecosystem Foundation, possible tools within MAGICapp, but also some results of a research project that we've been working with him. And when we're talking about adaptation, I think it's I think we need to make sure that we're working with the same semantics here. Adaptation is a term within guideline development that has a very specific context. You can either adopt a guideline, which was what the Norwegian Rheumatology Society did with the therapeutic drug monitoring guideline, and they adopted, so they completely accepted the existing clinical practice guideline without any modifications. In this case, there was translation, but the content of the guideline was identical, and then we call that guideline adaptation. But when we adapt guidelines with an A, that means that we're making modifications or changing. We're either adding new recommendations or we're potentially changing recommendations. Typically, we're localizing recommendations so that they are fit for the purpose in a local or regional or even a national use, or maybe in a supranational use. So adaptation in the context of guideline development has to be seen in the context of these modifications. So what are we, or where are we at with regards to guideline adaptation today? Guideline adaptation is not new, and we're looking at almost a quarter of a century of experience with guideline adaptation. I think guideline adaptation, something that we've been doing for a long time and has evolved over time. And here we have a small timeline, which I think illustrates where we've been coming from and where we're going towards quite clearly. So it starts before the year 2000 with some first ideas on guideline adaptation. The Royal College of Nursing in 2000 developed the first framework on guideline adaptation with a focus very much on implementation, and contextualizing guidelines so that they're more easily implementable. We have going forward from that almost 10 years further, the Alberta Ambassador Program, again, very much again with the idea of adapting guidelines so that we can facilitate their implementation. And then we're ADAPTI, or ADAPT, it depends on who you ask how you pronounce it, is an international consortium that developed a very clear process on guideline adaptation, which was very rigorous and very clear, but was very elaborate and very cumbersome. But a lot of organizations, including in Belgium, we modified, or we at least used large sections of this process to institutionalize guideline adaptation. And in 2014, we developed the SNAP-IT approach within MAGIC and the context of grade, where we'll go into a little bit more detail. And then 2017, we saw the grade development framework or process developed in the contents of the grade evidence to decision framework, where the grade development very clear but again very elaborate method of going through all the different evidence to decision framework steps to clarify where potentially changes or modifications are being made and why, so that you can finalize a new guideline which has a clear source, but has its very different contextual changes and modifications. So that's in sort of a nutshell the many years that have progressed across guideline adaptation, where starting from very much implementation issues, ending in 2017 much more with the guideline process issues, and I think we're now moving a little bit more back to the year 2000, where we're looking at guideline adaptation as something that needs to be a little bit less elaborate, that needs to be a little bit less strenuous, because we noticed that one of the main issues with guideline adaptation is that it takes a lot of time, and some people question whether adaptation is actually an alternative for de novo development, because de novo development tends to be just as elaborate and just as time consuming. So grade development, coming from the grade evidence to decision frameworks for in guideline development, where you can adopt, adapt, or even a de novo development from trustworthy recommendations, and the grade development process allows you to choose between those three options and gives you clear steps on how to approach that. And again, some experience with that in that framework, where the systematic and very transparent approach is very clear, but again, very cumbersome, very elaborate. SNAP-IT, what we started with in MAGICapp many years ago, is a process that was developed and originated from a very large, more than 200-page guideline on primary and secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease, more specifically the prevention of thrombosis, and all the anti-thrombotic therapy options that were available there. And one of the major issues with that guideline is it was published, it was huge, nobody actually read it, and by chucking this guideline to small sections, making it a multi-layered version of it within MAGICapp, we were able to then translate it in and adapt it into Norwegian, and this guideline was then also published as a Norwegian adapted version, and the process that we used for that was the SNAP-IT approach. And that was, I think, sort of the foundation for how we approached adaptation in MAGICapp. And again, this was a 5-step process in how to modify these recommendations. But key feature in that is you need your multi-layered guideline, and you need the different formats that allow you to do this adaptation in that form. Again, published in CHEST, so and all the experiences we found using that research method. How could that look like? So we had this is an example of a Danish Directorate of Health looking at this guideline, and this guideline was then multi-layered, and this is one on chronic the use of opioids in patients with chronic non-cancer pain, and this multi-layered guideline, which is here in English, developed with the collaboration of a master. The multi-layered formats, you recognize the summary findings table that colleague Per Vanvik just presented in the previous version of the section of this presentation. And these and here you see the recommendations, and in the Danish version, so the guideline is very similar, but the Danish version was then published with some adapted sections or some contextualized sections included. But I'll go into a little bit more detail how we use that process and how we tweaked it so that it's more clear and it's more visually attractive to see how the adaptation was done. This is an example of the grade adultment and grade pro GDT. And grade pro GDT is an alternative guideline development platform. And they use the evidence to decision framework as their basis. So that's a 12-step framework that goes through a whole series of judgments that need to be made to define whether an intervention is going to be recommended or not, defining the problem, looking at the trade-off between the desirable and undesirable effects, the certainty of the evidence, take into account the values and preferences, the balance of those effects. You look at resources that are required. You look at the certainty of the evidence of these required resources, cost effectiveness, equity, acceptability, and feasibility. And in grade development, all these different steps are gone through in scrutiny to see whether you want to follow the evidence from the source guideline, or whether you have reasons to modify these judgments in your specific local context. Which you can see that if you have a guideline with more than or multiple different recommendations, you have to go through dozens, if not hundreds, of these steps in order to come to a adapted guideline. And grade development requires you to go through all of them one by one and to make your judgments and to make your assessments. So this is one approach, but very elaborate and very cumbersome. What has changed over the years? Adaptation is now something which there are some clear steps on how to approach it. The right adapt checklist is, I think, one of those important milestones in guideline adaptation. This is a paper published in the Annals of Internal Medicine a couple of years ago, where this checklist that we can use to see whether all the steps that we think are important for trustworthy and transparent guideline adaptation have gone through. And this right adapt checklist is, I think, an important guide now for any type of adaptation process to make sure that all the steps are included that require this or make sure that the process is transparent and trustworthy. And this is an example of this checklist. I think many of you may have already seen this or probably used sections of this and at least recognize sections of this when you're approaching guideline adaptation. There are 7 sections with a whole series of different topics, up to 34 items, and it's modeled on the right statement, which is again something that comes from the guideline, de novo guideline development. And you see that there are elements on how the title should be described, how the cover page should be presented, executive summary, how that should look like, description of the health problems, aims and objectives, target populations, and so forth. And so this is only a small section of the 7 different sections. And this right adapted checklist, which I think a lot of people can use if it's freely available on the internet. It gives you an example of what the state or the checkpoint is. Here it's one on reporting the recommendations and indicating whether they're adapted, adopted, or de novo. It gives you a clear example of what this means and why it's important, and it gives you an example of how you can present it in your text. And I think this is an important section on guideline adaptation. It needs to be clear for the end user how and where the recommendation was modified. It needs to be clear that it was modified, and it needs to be clear why it was modified. And here's a example of doing that you can just put in parentheses that it was adopted, for instance. There are some key limitations still, and when we're talking about guideline adaptation, and limitations which I think still need to be addressed, but I think there are advances in the field that are starting to look at these limitations, but many of these limitations are key across all the processes and across all the platforms that still apply today. Here's a couple that I'll just mention, and before going into some examples, you need, for guideline adaptation, you need, first of all, very good, trustworthy source guidelines. It's impossible to do guideline adaptation when the sources are not trustworthy. When the sources are bad, the adapted content will also be bad. So so someone or something in the world needs to be doing de novo guideline development, because if not, no one will be able to adapt from there. And I think the WHO plays a very important role in this, in investing a lot of resources in de novo guideline development. And I think these large and very trustworthy guidelines can be the source of guideline adaptation. But in any case, there needs to remain an important emphasis on de novo guideline development. Today, there still are a lot of different frameworks, there are a lot of different standards, there are a lot of different processes, complex processes. I think we need to try and navigate to something which is workable, but very clear, and that is that we agree upon. There is still a shortage of guidance and tools. We do have for instance, the right adapt checklist, but if you just Google guideline adaptation, you'll find dozens, if not hundreds of different processes across the world, and a lot of different guidance handbooks. And so in comparison to like GRADE, and we don't have something similar from guideline adaptation. And I think still the fact that guideline adaptation, what the goal or what the focus is it about implementation? Is it about dissemination? Is it about resource or less resource demanding guideline development? The fact that this is still a discussion point, I think, clarifies why there's still a lot of semantic discussion on all these processes and standards. It still remains resource demanding, so there are a lot of organizations that have embarked on guideline adaptation that have stopped because they found that the idea that it'd probably be quicker and it'll be faster and less resource demanding isn't always played out that way. So I think we need to really focus on making the processes, making the methods a lot more or a lot less resource demanding, making them a lot more efficient, so that people and organizations can embark on guideline adaptation in a much more quick and efficient way. Translation is and remains an important issue because many of the guidelines that are used as source guidelines are English language guidelines, but a lot of the countries that are doing the adaptation do not use English as their native language. And if you want to embark on guideline adaptation, translating the content remains an issue, and I'll talk about a little bit more detail on how we can address language translation. In Belgium, where I work, we have the additional complexity that not only do we need language translation, but I live in a trilingual country where all the content needs to be available in 3 different languages: in Dutch, in French, and in German. So translation is something that we have a lot of issues with. And then another, I think, and that's something that we're still very much in its infancy, is how do we update living guidelines, but not only the living guidelines, how do we update adapted content of living guidelines? That's something that we have very little experience with. But if your source guideline is continuously updating, that means that your adapted content needs to be continuously updated as well. And how to keep track of that, and how to clarify which sections of your adapted guideline are in line with the living guideline or not in line with the living guideline. That's something that we still need to work on and get some clear answers on. And implementation does remain an important step, because guideline adaptation, I think, as the semantic discussion already said, some of the issues with guideline adaptation is to make guidelines more implementable in a local context. It needs to be clear how we're doing that. And I think one of the main issues that we've noticed with guideline adaptation is that when is your context more important than the evidence base that is driving a guideline, and when does the evidence base warrant that you need to change the context? And that's something that a lot of countries, a lot of organizations struggle with, is when they're adapting content, that they're using the contextual organization and the way that things work in their country as a way to justify an adaptation, whereas in some cases it should probably be the other way around, that your new guideline should be something that's driving change in your context. And so contextualization and implementation is something within guideline adaptation that we need to clarify. When is the context sufficiently important to be able to drive an adaptation? There are luckily some advances already, and we have our evidence to decision frameworks that clarify for end users why and how we're making our judgments. We have the World Wide Web and Internet and digitalization of guideline content, which allows us to more quickly access other content, and probably more quickly also integrate it into our local guideline databases. And we'll see that these digitization also has some interesting features with regards to translation and copy pasting things. We have these reporting checklists already in place, which I think is an important milestone. Right. So here's a key challenge. We've like Per already mentioned, we have over 22. I think it's already 25 BMJ RapidRecs. Have they been adapted? Have they been reused? And it doesn't seem to be very much the case that a lot of these BMJ rapid recommendations, despite the fact that they were developed using a very trustworthy methods and rigorous methods, it doesn't seem to be that they're being adapted in a very durable manner, but we do have things ongoing to assist organizations, to assist countries that would like to adapt these guidelines. So here's an idea of the living guideline on the drugs for COVID-19. And so we've seen the infographic here in the previous presentation. And I would like now to just look at this bottom section of our wheel, where we're looking at trying to improve dissemination, trying to improve the input or the impact of a guideline by making sure that they are adapted, that they are fit for use in their local context. And I want to present that using three different, because I'm trying to keep track of time here. What I want to look at is a product that we developed using the Gateway project. Gateway was a project that we did together with the WHO on adapting living guideline and the COVID-19 guideline. A lot of effort was being done to develop this guideline, and we wanted to make sure that, or at least together with the WHO, wanted to give other member states the capacity of using that content and trying to make local versions of that guideline in their own language, so that they could be more efficiently used in the different member state countries. So we had this living guideline, which was huge and very with a lot of information. I want to make sure to improve the dissemination with this digital platform, and then especially adaptation and translation. So we developed a process which took into account all the features of the Red Adapt statement, where we developed a process and module that was linked to MAGICapp. This was done with a whole different series of steps, and then we developed a prototype. This prototype was then tested in 2 WHO member states, and with 2 different languages, Spanish and Russian. And using all the information and all the feedback that we received from these experts and from the user testing in these member states, we developed a module which in a future version of MAGICapp will be integrated, but is now still a standalone prototype module. And the module uses this stepwise approach to guideline adaptation, which I think you will recognize a lot of the adapt or the adaptee steps. You have to set up your process and plan. Obviously, you have to select the recommendations that you want to adapt, and you import then these recommendations into MAGICapp if they are not already in MAGICapp. And then per recommendation, you look at the PICO question, you look at the perspective, and we generally use a patient perspective in guideline development from MAGIC perspective. But when you look at public health, you may want to look at this from a different perspective, like an organizational perspective or a health payers perspective. And then look at the direction and the strength of the recommendation. If there is agreement, you can then confirm the agreement with the justifications and modify where needed, and confirm the agreements in the different EDT factors and modify if necessary. If there is immediately disagreement, then you have to more rigorously go through all the ETD factors where you have to revise them, where you have to probably even vote on the ETD factors and modify and justify where needed. And so there's a sort of a two-stepped approach where if there already is an agreement from the very start, then it becomes a lot more easy. If there's disagreement, then you're moving much more into the grade development steps. And then finally, there's the summary of the judgments, and then publishing, where translation could have a place there. But we will see that translation may also potentially have a place earlier up in the process. And then dynamic updating, and this is something which is again still in its infancy, but monitoring and evaluating the steps is important. And I will go and try and show you this online. So I'm going to switch to my browser here for a second. So here is the tool that we're developing. This is a guideline recommendation on the therapeutic drug monitoring that Per already talked to you about. This is the recommendation. We suggest proactive therapeutic drug monitoring rather than reactive therapeutic drug monitoring, none. And some additional remarks. And this prototype, and I have to move the screen around here, allows you to go through the different EDT factors, and you can edit them. Here I made a version with a change, where in this case, does the panel have any immediate concerns with this recommendation? You can clarify whether there are concerns or not. If there's some minor concerns, the initial assessment will become orange. Apologies. You can clarify why there are, and this is completely hypothetical. I said that for German context, this could be an issue, and you can save. And this allows you to go step by step during a panel meeting on why or how you would address this, the adaptation. And then for here, instead of the 12 factor, we use a 7 factor ETD judgments. You can go through them one by one, and you have the original text, where you have the original text from the guideline, which you could just copy paste into the adaptation text. And in the adaptation text, you can use any type of feature which you like. You can potentially make colors and change elements where you would like to introduce adapted. And you can then change your ETD judgment where needed, and you can make an adaptation statement here, which sort of summarizes what it is that drove the change or drove the changes, and then allows you at the end to make an adaptation summary. You can make the recommendation being the same as the original, or the changed direction or strength, and you can add the new recommendation. And this allows you to go through all the same steps, recommendation by recommendation, and then you can go back into the guideline. And then I have to go back to my presentation, which I think is here. Yeah. So this is the module that we designed in this project. We piloted in 2 countries, in Argentina and in Kazakhstan. People found it to be useful. There are still some issues that need to be addressed, and we need the tool does not excuse or does not free up any time for that would be needed for training, and people still need to be trained in the process. The tool just helps you using all the steps to make sure that you haven't missed anything. It is an easy visualization for people who are who know the methods, who are clearly up to speed with the methods, but it also gives you some opportunities to use this during panel meetings so that you can go through everything step by step. However, it still has translation challenges because our tool that we developed, this prototype, was all in English. And that brings me to a second thing, and I'm going to quickly just go through this more quickly, is translation. Translation is also something which I think is important in adaptation. There are a lot of different ways which you can approach adaptation, translation. Well, one thing that we've been piloting with the WHO is that we adapt first and then translate. That means, in this case, that generally WHO guidelines are translated in a series of different languages, but generally these guidelines are identical. So they are the same guideline, but in different languages. And then what we needed to introduce was a very stringent and very elaborate translation process, which takes into account a lot of different things around versioning. This does seem to work. It's also the way we do it in Belgium. We make the guideline in one language and then translate the full guideline to different languages. And sometimes we make the guideline in sort of a mix of 2 languages and then derive different language versions from that mixed guideline. And another way which you could do is then first translate and then adapt, where you translate the source guideline first and then adapt, but then you need to make sure that you're keeping track of your adaptations across 2 different guidelines. And a third way, and I think that's what I want to show you here in just a second, is you can also adapt and then translate along the way. And how this could work is using a new feature. This is a MAGICapp, inside MAGICapp we're now. This is a test guideline which I developed with a series of students, where we translated a nice guideline on chronic kidney disease into Dutch and put it into MAGICapp. Obviously, well, you won't be able to read anything here because it's in Dutch, but you may want to use this guideline as a source for an adaptation. But using this in a panel meeting is completely impossible. So one of the options you could do is translate this section, and you have to tell MAGICapp what language it's looking at. In this case, it's Dutch, and you want to translate it to English. You submit, and the recommendation hasn't been submitted, so I'll try it again. So we translate from Dutch into English. For some reason, walking up. But there you go. And it's translating, and it uses DeepL as a tool. And you will find that this section is now added in the at the end. And it's identical, but all the text sections have been translated into English. And you can use this then to open up the research evidence, the evidence to decision factors have all been translated. And so any text that or any text block that was part of this recommendation has now been translated from Dutch into English, which allows much more easily to discuss in the panel sections which you would want to change or adapt or whatever. And in the end, you could even then delete all the original Dutch version sections and leave only the translated content with the adaptations included. So translation, this is definitely not something that you could use as really a formal translation of a full guideline, but it is something that you can use as a tool throughout an adaptation process where you want to discuss something from a source guideline, but in a language which all the people around the table are more familiar with. And then finally, to end up, adaptation is one thing, but another thing is how do you then address or try to disseminate your adapted content to your end users, to your public. And we've learned a lot of things from the GALA project. This is a Global Evidence Local Adaptation Project, where it's an NEDtP funded project where we adapted guidelines on newborn and infant health care in 3 sub-Saharan African countries. And one of our deliverables was making infographics for these different guidelines, and infographics tailored for healthcare providers, for patients, and also for policymakers. And I think one of these infographics is a lot more in line with global health. This is one on hand hygiene for infection prevention. So many of these guidelines are based on WHO guidelines, and for instance, here we made an infographic on how hand hygiene for infection control in hospitalized newborns and infants. There's a strong recommendation for multi-component interventions to improve compliance with hand hygiene. Who is this recommendation applied to? And then we made some details on advice to policymakers, where a lot of focus was put on values and resourcing cost effectiveness. This was information that was derived from qualitative research in all of the different countries that were involved in the project, and these qualitative findings found their way into MAGICapp and are now part of this infographic. And elements on equity, elements on reminders and communications were involved, and this is including also some information on how this recommendation was made. And we made a series of different infographics, not only on hand hygiene but also on enteral feeding. When to start enteral feeding. In this case, it's for health workers. We also made one within 27 hours after birth. And this is, again, you recognize the VMJ infographics in this as well, with a population that we, with some background information, which we found was very important when talking to healthcare providers, that they wanted to know a lot of things about, what is this exactly, this enteral feeding, what does it apply to, what are implementation considerations, and this is information that was that we found from the qualitative evidence finding that parents and caregivers need to be told that it's not because a child is being fed through a tube that it means it's terminally ill, and this type of information then found its way into this infographic, and this is very contextual, adapted content from an originally WHO guideline, which focused much more on the evidence. And I think I've probably been talking way too long, so I'm going to end here and open up the floor to any questions, if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Delbo, for very interesting and informative session. A lot of information indeed. Thank you so much. So let's see if there's any question and suggestions from participants. Malika?
We don't have questions from the participants, but I can ask, I have 2 questions if I can ask them.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so my first question is about, you mentioned that guideline adaptation is a very resource intensive process. So my question is, what are some ways that we can make it less resource demanding, especially for our region, which has various levels of capacities and resources in different countries? I mean, what level of expertise are required to use this MAGICapp platform? And my second question is there any use of AI in the MAGICapp platform?
Well, for the first question, I think, which is a very important one, because maybe I didn't stress enough that there are solutions. And I think the first and most important solution is, if you want to start with guideline adaptation, the only way to make it less resource demanding is to make sure that you are working with a source guideline that is of high quality and that is digitally structured. If it's digitally structured and if it has all the elements in the right place, then it becomes so much easier to just import sections and modify them, and then to justify why you're modifying them. But if you have to do everything new, if you have to go into your guideline and try to find, why are they making this recommendation? Where is this evidence coming from? Is the evidence correct? Is the grading correct? If you have to do all that work again, you have to make sure that you're going to be spending a lot of time just going through the guideline and assessing its trustworthiness. But just if you stick with trustworthy guidelines that are digitally structured, and you can reuse that information, then you're winning a major amount of time. And the way that MAGICapp can help, if we are importing more and more digitally structured, high quality guidelines, which you can then use, and that's one of the things that we're also looking at, is developing agreements between organizations that you can actually use their guideline to adapt them, that you have to make sure that it's clear that you've adapted their guideline, that you can just import them, make a copy of them, and then change and clarify where you've made the changes and why. Then it becomes a lot more easier. So I think that's important. If you don't have these high quality digitally structured guidelines, then you really have to think twice about adaptation, because you're probably going to be taking just as much time as doing a de novo guideline. Does MAGICapp use any AI? It uses AI, and the only AI currently that we're using is the DeepL plugin that we're using for the translation. It doesn't use any other AI for the moment, because it's not meant to do any type of processing. It's not meant to do any type of big data calculations. It's meant to guide your processing. So the AI that is currently being used in evidence-based medicine or guideline development happens in other the tools, but can be linked to MAGICapp. But MAGICapp doesn't use a lot of AI for the moment, except for DeepL.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Vandy. Thank you, Dr. Delvaux. With all this, now, for sake of time, I just want to invite Dr. Arash Rashidian, Director of Science, Information and Dissemination at the WHO Regional Office for Eastern Mediterranean, for his kind closing remarks. Dr. Arash, over to you. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Many thanks. First of all, I'm really grateful to our dear guests, and Nicholas and Per. Excellent presentations and very useful for us, and touching an important program. It was referred at the start by Mehnaz that, these are part of the agenda to support countries for national systems, national processes, as you have seen. And also, I also would like to refer to the document that Malika shared on the chat box. So the focus of our work has been to try to support countries in a way that they can establish programs which are self-sustained, relying on national capacity. And when they use the best available experience globally, they do it in a way that responds to their needs, rather than focus from project to project. In that sense, I also found the two presentations very useful in a very sort of the issue of adaptation has been a major issue for anyone involved in the guideline business. In the issue of Nicholas mentioned, it's wrong to assume adaptation is only for your country doesn't have enough money. It's about efficient use of resources, making the best available evidence is applied properly, and also guideline might require certain adaptations to the local setting, depending on the setting that we are talking about. What had happened in the last, I would say, couple of decades, a lot of emphasis was on how to perfect the methodology for adaptation. And by that focus on perfecting the methodology, the adaptation process had become also a very tedious process. either, I mean, you follow those processes, but it's so time consuming that the gain in efficiency becomes limited and not that much there, or the risk in biases, etc. With the new innovations in the processes, like the one that amend use of one resource against the other, but as something that is available and help. These are, I mean, sort of solutions that the countries need. I mean, something that help them to ease the process, can link different agenda with each other. They show the examples that was shown about sort of the quick translation of the core resources into the language. These are really helpful. But then all of these are part of a system. So I mean that when we talk of guideline adaptation or guideline implementation, we need the sort of national consensus development. We need decision-making about recommendation. All those are things that are beyond which tool we are using. These are more about, I mean, how the processes work. And in that sense, I would again refer to the document that was shared earlier. The importance of that is that we really need to make sure the priority setting on guidelines and national level is done properly. The decision-making process is there, making sure the guidelines are treated as a sort of multidisciplinary approach. And within that context, when we use the tools that help us to adapt more efficiently, we actually gain a lot without losing what is meant by a national guideline program. So again, probably I talk too much. I mean, for a closing, I would have been expected to just say a few words, but I'm delighted of the topic and I find it really important. I'm very grateful to my colleagues in Evidence and Data to Policy team. I'm really grateful to colleagues from MAGICapp team and from the Catholic University of Leuven as well. So all the colleagues that contributed to this seminar, so that's really delighted. And as I mentioned, I mean, we have a smaller participation pool here than usual for our normal seminars, but it will be made available, and colleagues will put it on sort of our resources as well. So it will be there for anyone to refer to, and even if you want to recommend it to your colleagues as well. So I mean, the link will be available for everyone to use it. So many thanks again, and I stop here. Back to you, Mehnaz.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raj, for the closing remarks. So we are now after 1:30. So I think that, if there is no comments, there is no suggestions, we can close the session. Thank you again, Dr. Van Beek and Dr. Delbo, for the nice presentations. And I want to also just invite everyone and encourage you to attend our next session, which will be on 20th of May. Malika, she has put the agenda and the poster of our next session also on the chat box. So we really want to see you in our next session as well. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye.